I'm going to talk about, so probably I should mention that my background is in experimental condensed matter and material sciences, but for the last 5 to 6 years, I've been working together with my colleagues on utilizing machine learning to extract more insights from experimental data. And so this is everything I'm going to show today is teamwork, and here are some core team members. So I listed them here. The first 3 elements in this list are my team on autonomous electron microscopy at ORNL. The 4th and 5th element in this list are people, Yong Tao Liu and Rama Vasudevan, are people who work on scanning probe microscopy, and there are a lot of exchange of ideas and methods between electron microscopy and scanning probe microscopy. And finally, the last person on that list is Sergei Kalinin, who started this whole field of smart microscopy or AI-driven microscopy back in 2009, and I was his postdoc from 2015 to 2018, and basically this is how I got into this field. So we are not in the business of creating new machine learning algorithms. What we do is that we take the existing ones and tailor them to solve specific experimental problems, right? And this, of course, includes tweaking them here and there. Yeah, so this is where I work. It's Oak Ridge National Lab in Eastern Tennessee. I think I met with some of you there. So the lab was established as a part of the Manhattan projects during the World War II, but since then it has significantly diversified its research directions, and like all the research that I do is completely open. In fact, our funding sponsors insist that everything we produce, papers, code, data, should be available to public. So the research is sponsored by the Interconnected Science Ecosystem Initiative at Oak Ridge National Lab, which aims at connecting instrumental platforms to high-performance computing facilities of ORNL. And also the actual instruments are located at the Center for Nanophase and Material Sciences, which is a scientific user facility. It's one of the 5 nanoscience research centers in the US. The other 4 are located at Argonne Lab, Sandia, Berkeley, and Brookhaven. Okay. Yeah, so we are very lucky to be a home of some of the most powerful microscopes in the world. These microscopes allows us visualizing atomic structures in real space, identifying chemical states of individual atoms, studying symmetry breaking distortions, quantum phenomena, and even performing momentum resolved spectroscopies. So for example, in these 2 images, you can see the actual, these are the actual experimental images, and you can distinguish easily 2 types of atoms, the lattice atom and the dopant atoms at 2 different dopant concentrations. And so it allows you visualizing atomic positions with the angstrom precision, but it also can distinguish different chemical elements. So it's a pretty powerful tool. Okay. So in addition to simply visualizing matter at the atomic scale, we can also use these techniques to manipulate individual atoms and assemble them into new structures, potentially open a path towards a fabrication of atomic circuits for future quantum technology devices. So in this example, and as the video is looped, so it keeps replaying. But what one of my colleagues did here is that he took an atom that was in the top left corner of this field of view, and he used a beam of an electron microscope to push this atom all the way to the top right corner, right? So the material itself is graphene. You can see these elements of honeycomb lattice here, and the atom is silicon. Okay, so if we can move individual atoms, then we can move more than one atom and assemble them into different structures. We like to call these structures artificial molecules. So here we created these artificial structures or artificial molecules by moving different dopant atoms in graphene lattice just like that. And so it could come up with some funny structures that do not necessarily exist in nature by themselves, right? And in addition to moving atoms, you can also do some sculpturing. Here we wrote ORNL logo by just removing chunks of atoms in this perovskite material. Okay, so finally, so far I talked only about the imaging capabilities, but you can also, there are some very cool spectroscopic modes. And one of the, what you can do is that, so okay, let's say you do some atomic circuit engineering. And how do you know that what you created actually makes sense for applications, right? So in this particular case, we wanted to tune a band gap, right? And so you can do electron energy loss spectroscopy with a nanoscale resolution to map band gap for different elements of your structure. And so you can see it's different for this freestanding part, the edge part, and the single vacancy line, and for the bulk of the sample, right? So I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself because actually there was quite a bit of machine learning involved in fabricating the structure, but just to give you an idea. Okay, but so if you work in the electron microscopy field, that what you usually spend a lot of time on, I mean, okay, so just thinking how to say it carefully. When you work in a single domain, right, there are some objectives in that domain, so which you're focused on. So in electron microscopy, for example, an objective would be higher resolution or coming up with the new spectroscopic modes, right? But it's also important to keep an eye on a bigger picture, and this is what we realized not so long ago. And so how does what we look at in electron microscopy connects to the outside world, right? To the actual materials and on the bigger scale and devices. And so we formulated a set of challenges, or more like tasks. And one of them is, can we get material-specific information from microscopy data? So what does it mean? Well, usually, so the experimental images that I showed you before were very nice and beautiful. That's the ones we used for publications. But most of the time your experiment looks like this. And so in this case, what you see is that you have a two-dimensional material, I think it's graphene, which is exposed to electron irradiation, and there are a lot of solid-state chemistry transformations going on. You can see defects being formed, they merge together, they split apart. So lots of interesting physics and chemistry happening here, relevant, for example, to battery materials, right? The question is, can we go from here to here, where we can identify dominant classes of defects, trace their evolution in time, analyze their reaction rate, transition probabilities, diffusion constants, and so on, right? So that's the first question. The second one is, okay, in microscopy, we always look at the relatively small region of a sample, right? So then how do we know that whatever information we, so it's like, we look at the relatively small region of a sample, but for actual applications, we need to be able to predict materials behavior in a larger parameter space, not just in that small particular area, region that we are looking at. And the question is, can we, perhaps learn a generative model from our observations that we can use to predict materials behavior in the larger parameter space, and that those predictions should come with quantified uncertainty. And finally, can we harness this data that streams from microscopes to allow real-time feedback for autonomous experimentation and atomic manipulation? Because all those experiments that I showed you before, they were done pretty much manually. So it's through trial and effort, good enough for publishing a one-off paper, but not good enough for making those structures reproducibly towards actual technology. Okay. Yeah, so I wanted very briefly to describe some of our prior work on applying machine learning to the already collected experimental data, which partially address one of the tasks that I mentioned. So yeah, so we started in 2017 with utilizing simple conv nets to extract atomic features from raw experimental data. The idea was, okay, so our experimental data looks something like this. And what we want to get is the type and positions of all the atoms while removing all the noise and all the irrelevant parts like this type of contamination. And at that time, we used a simple unit. Obviously, that's not a unit, but it's just a schematic to achieve this, right? And it worked very beautifully. And now it's like trivial, but in 2017, it was kind of a big deal in the field of microscopy. And now that we can do this, how about and the important point that we can do this within a fraction of a second, and a conventional method would take much longer time. Okay, so now that we can do this, how about we analyze a stack of images centered around the same field of view to trace the evolution of different atoms of atomic defects, and reconstruct the spatial temporal trajectories. And by the way, I talk a lot about defects. The reason I talk about defects is that the ideal material is boring, right? If you want to store information, you need to create defect. If you want to do some catalysis applications, you need to create defects. So that's why defects are important. And so we reconstructed the spatial temporal trajectories and had some fun analyzing diffusion coefficients, transition probabilities, and so on. Right. So, but important thing is that this, we wouldn't be able to do this without deep learning. Okay. So we already had a speaker earlier this week who mentioned that in the material sciences, it is very tough to get people share their data, right? And it is much worse in experimental community than in the computational community. And so we kind of decided to show the way. And in 2019, we teamed up with Citrine Informatics to create a database of all the experimental defects that we observed in our experiments on graphene sample. And we didn't stop there. We thought, okay, so now people have access to our databases, to our database of defects, but can they reproduce the entire workflow? Can they reproduce the entire analysis? And yes, we shared our code on GitHub, but not everyone who works with experiments actually have GitHub or uses it actively. So what we decided to do is that we come up with this idea of Jupyter paper. And in Jupyter paper, your code is actually, it's supposed to be video, but I'm not sure how to play it. Anyways, in Jupyter paper, your regular text and figures are intermixed with code cells, which are hidden by default, but you can unroll them and use to reproduce the analysis performed in the paper, and also to adapt it to your own problems. We initially demonstrated it in Google Colab, but it can be done in regular Jupyter Notebook as well. At that time, it was 2019, we were in touch with multiple journal editors, editors of multiple journals. We wanted to take it to the next level. I think there was not enough interest from the journal side, but maybe things have changed, or maybe we can do it through archive or something like that. So if you have any ideas, I would be happy to discuss. Okay. So in addition to doing this feature extraction, we can also play with latent variable models. And the idea here is, can we condition those models like variational autoencoder on the data that we already know to help it discover something that we don't know, right? And in this case, we used it to okay, so the latent variables of variational autoencoder do not necessarily have physical meaning. But in some cases, you can connect it to actual physics of the system. And here, we found that it essentially describes an order parameter of a system undergoing large-scale structural evolution, right? And also, it's not limited to atom-resolved data. We can, here we analyzed a system where ferroelectric domains we were observing the growth of ferroelectric domains on the surface, and what variational autoencoder allowed us doing was disentangling the degree of switching from the complexity of the domain structure. And the key part here was that we accounted for the rotational invariances, because in this particular experiment, if you take a domain and then you rotate it by some arbitrary angle, it's still the same physics. So again, we used something that we already know about the system to help us find something that we may not have necessarily known at the time. Right? That's the idea. Okay. So up until now, everything I was talking about was done after the experiment was over. Meaning that, and sometimes it's like 6 months after, sometimes it's a year after. Meaning that whatever we identified in our analysis, we cannot, if we need to go back and to check it in the experiment is long over by that time. Sometimes a student or postdoc who did that experiment has already left the lab. So realistically, you just cannot, use insight from your analysis in your, you cannot check them in your experiment. And so how about, so the question that we ask is that, is it possible to analyze data on the fly during the experiment and then use the results of that analysis to steer our experiments, right? And at that time we realized that there is really no infrastructure, neither on the software nor on hardware part to do this. But we were very inspired by the progress in self-driving cars, and this is a slide from 2019. So at that time, it looked like self-driving cars are right around the corner. Now we know it's not really the case, but we were really inspired by it, and we thought, well, how about we create a self-driving microscope where driving happens on the atomic scale? Okay, so these are the, finally have arrived at my outline. So these are the three types of experiments that I wanted to talk today about. The first one is forward experiment. We call it forward experiment, which basically aims at doing the same type of sort of imitating human workflows, but doing it much faster, efficient, and more robust, in a more robust and reliable way. And second one is what we call the inverse experiment that goes somewhat beyond what a human operator can do. And finally, the hypothesis-driven active learning and experiments, where we take advantage of some of the existing prior knowledge in the form of phenomenological model to drive our experiments. Okay, so sorry, I need to drink water. Do you have any questions so far? Yeah.
Yeah, I think a very stupid question. But do you move one atom at a time to make those structures?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question, and it's directly relevant to its, let's say, commercialization of this technology, right? Yes, so we, in scanning and transmission electron microscope, we have a focus beam of size like 1 angstrom, right? And so we use it to move those atoms. Yes, it's one of a time. In principle, you can do, I mean, it's not impossible from the technical and hardware perspective to have multiple beams. It's possible, but you need to have a use case for that, right? So now it's all done for fundamental sciences mostly, right? So if you go towards applications and commercializations, then we will have to make those changes in the hardware. So that's one thing. Another thing is that there is no comprehensive theory of electron beam matter interactions. So it's not like the results that I showed you, they were achieved through many trials and errors. And so because it's like, where exactly do you put electron beam? Do you place it on atom? Do you place on the next atom? Do you place on the bond? Right? So those kind of things are something that there is, like, we are working actively collaborating with people who are developing those theories, but at this point there is no comprehensive theory. That's why this is why it's perfect for machine learning, right? Can a black box model learn this, and then you utilize it? And we have a collaboration with Google on that, using reinforcement learning to learn the optimal pathways. It's not a part of this presentation because it's still in actively, we're still exploring it, but yeah.
Yeah, and the follow-up, when you are moving one atom, how do you make sure the other two that you already, you want the third one to put together and make a structure?
How am I sure that it stays there?
Yes.
Yeah. So for that, again, right now it's through trial and error, but the idea is that we can stream the experimental data to external computing resources where we can quickly run some simulations to evaluate the stability of the structure that we created.
Thank you.
Max, maybe you just clarify a little bit the synthesis of these largely 2D materials you're looking like, how that happens, right? Because there's the moving the atoms around, but the synthesis of the sheets is not done that way. Right?
No.
Yeah.
It's
so
more of
it's
more like It's more of you have a 2D material and you want to draw to do some lithography to create, for example, atomic circuits, right? So this is where your starting point, yes, someone has to synthesize that material, but then to turn that material into some nano device. This is where electron microscopy comes in. Or you want to create a qubit, right? So you have this pristine material, which is boring, and you want to create a qubit that can be relevant for quantum computation and such. So this is again where this type of technology comes in. But you're absolutely right. Yes, we start with the material synthesized in a conventional way, and then we modify it towards some tailoring towards specific application with electron microscopy. Okay. All right. So yeah, so the forward experiment, the idea here is that we already know what objects we're interested in, but it's just, for humans it's too difficult to detect all of them in real time, and so we replace that human part with some pre-trained neural net, right? So in this example, in this case, for example, so this is the raw data obtained from a microscope, and we want to identify types and positions of different atoms. I'm not sure if it's clearly seen from here, but all these boxes are drawn around different types of atomic defects. And then once we identify them, we say, well, okay, how about we go to all these red boxes locations and maybe do some spectroscopic measurements there to gain deeper insight about their properties. Or maybe we go to all these black box locations, and then we blast them with electron beam to induce transitions into a different structural state, and so on, right? Okay, so that's the idea. Of course, the first thing that we need to do is that we can, in principle, run all this deep learning stuff using some graphics card that comes with a that we can install on the control PC, but it's not really the best way to do it. And so we worked with our integration team who facilitated connection between microscopes that we have in one building and computing facilities in a different building. But basically, the idea here is that, in principle, you can log in from your home into, I don't know, let's say a DGX box with 16 GPUs, open the Jupyter notebook there, and from it control your experiment. So start some script that will run experiment autonomously, right? So that's the idea, and now it is possible to do it. Okay. So this is the type of experiment we want to do. But the problem with pre-trained neural nets is the out of distribution data, right? So these are not my picks because I don't own Tesla, but I took them from the internet. But it's really funny, right? Obviously, there was probably not many these types of objects in the training data. That's why it confused it. Or here, I think it confused the moon with a stop. With a traffic light, a yellow traffic light. So, anyways, this is a well-known problem, right? And there are several ways to deal with it. The first one is scale is all you need, right? So you have large enough data, you learn this latent manifold, and then all new observations will land onto that manifold between training points. Okay, well, unfortunately, we don't have really a lot of training data, at least not in the experiments that I'm talking about today, right? The second one is causal representation learning. I'm really a big fan of it in a sense. I follow all the literature, all the recent reviews. But then the idea is, can we learn high-level causal variables from low-level, high-dimensional data? But at this point, it seems like it's all at the level of toy examples, and it's nowhere near enough for using in real experiments, right? And the second one, sort of a little bit dumb way, but I like it, is as long as you can distinguish between interpolation and extrapolation regimes, and retrain or fine-tune your model once you are in the extrapolation mode, then you're good, right? Right. So we use deep ensembles for that, and already there were talks this week showing that they outperform many other techniques for uncertainty quantification. And again, as I pointed out, we don't really have much databases with labeled experimental data, so we always start with simulations, right? So if it's atomic scale and probably we'll use something like ab initio MD to prepare our structures. Then we create multi-slice simulations to create images, and then we train an ensemble of neural nets using this data, and then we apply it to real experimental data. And usually what happens here is that we obtain partially reconstructed features, and then we'll have to remove some, well, basically refine the data, do some manual labeling, right? And then retrain ensemble usually using this new experimental data. And after several iterations, you will eventually get a pretty robust feature finder, which can also provide pretty reliable uncertainty quantification. Okay, and now that you have this robust neural net for recognizing types and positions of different atoms and atomic defects in the images, you can do something like that, where at each step of atomic fabrication, you get a precise position and types of all the atoms and atomic defects within your field of view, and you use this information to adjust your electron beam strategy. So so this just shows that you can do it in real time. So this is something that was not possible to do before, and now it is possible. It allows us much higher degree of control over the structures that we can prepare. So for example, just to demonstrate the degree of control that we have, in this case, so Kevin Recopriori is the person who did this, and he basically draw an ORNL logo by removing a single sulfur atom from this molybdenum disulfide structure along the predefined pathway. So these are so-called single vacancy lines, and it just shows the degree of control that we have. And that's why I'm so bullish on the idea that we can build atomic scale circuits for future quantum technology applications. Okay, the next one is what we call inverse experiment. And the idea here is that in many cases, we already know what physics we are interested in. Like we are interested in superconductivity, ferroelectric switching, studying plasmonic modes, and so on. And we also know that this behavior is typically encoded in spectroscopic data that we can measure in principle anywhere in the sample, right? It could be something like size of the superconducting gap, polarization loop area, peak intensities, and so on. And what we don't know is what type of structures produce that behavior, right? We have some idea from theory, but it frequently breaks down in real materials. So we want to learn what type of structures host that behavior. And we want to do it with as few measurements as possible, ideally by measuring less than 5% of the entire grid. And the reason for that, well, first of all, there are beam-sensitive materials, like the material can decompose if you measure it for too long time. So the material will get destroyed before you can even complete your measurement. There are some other time, financial, and other constraints. So you want to do it really fast. Okay, so, and that's how we do it now. Of course, if you probably all familiar with the active learning and Bayesian optimization setup, so it looks very similar. It's pretty much what it is. There are a few changes here that we do at the initial stage of this workflow. Basically, we start with obtaining a large image over a relatively large field of view. We split it into image patches at each pixel, right? And then the second thing that we do is that we create what we call a scalarizer, which is basically how we convert our spectroscopic data into a physical property of interest, right? It could be a 1D spectroscopic data or 2D spectroscopic data, but the idea is that there is a particular behavior that we're interested in, so how do we convert that measured spectra into that behavior? And there are almost infinite number of possibilities how we do it. Right, so once we did that, we make random, we select some random locations and perform measurements there to create some seed data to initialize an active learning algorithm. And then we use the deep kernel learning, which was originally, as far as I know, introduced by Andrew Gordon Wilson in 2015. And this technique combines a deep neural net and a Gaussian process. So deep neural net takes high-dimensional data, projects it into a latent space where a Gaussian process operates. And the advantage, of course, is that it So the weights of a neural net and the hyperparameters of Gaussian process are learned simultaneously, and once the training is done, you make a prediction on all the remaining patches of data, and you can obtain predictive mean and uncertainty, and which you can combine into the acquisition function to derive the next measurement point. So that's how you do, active learning Bayesian optimization, basically. Okay, and so we did it for several experiments. This was the first ever experiment where we did this. It was a proof of concept. So we basically say find, so this is all done autonomously, right? So you tell a microscope, well, I want to find all the regions where this particular plasmonic mode is maximized, go and find them. And it goes and finds them, right? And then you come back and you look at the result, right? And then you say, well, how about we change the search criteria and let's find all the regions of our sample where the ratio of two plasmonic modes is maximized. So this is the same field of view, and now it identifies different parts of the sample, just as we expected, right? So looks pretty trivial, but it was the first time it ran on an actual microscope. Yeah, we can extend it to other materials and measurements. In this case, we were basically looking at the correlation between the structural data and the local electric and magnetic fields that could be measured through the so-called 40-step measurements. And we found some very interesting correlations, which we are still trying to understand, but the point is that it works. And again, it's not limited just to atomically resolved data or electron microscopy. We transferred this technique to the scanning probe microscopy, where we were able to identify different types of topological defects where a particular ferroelectric switching behavior was maximized. So that was pretty cool. The interesting thing is that it took us so long to publish our first proof of concept paper that this paper actually came first, even this was like experiment number 4. So it was funny. Okay, so finally, I don't know, do you have any questions? No? I still need to drink water, so. Yeah, sorry. I woke up with a terrible sore throat today. I tested myself for COVID. It's not COVID, but it's still very unpleasant. Sorry.
Sorry. On the active learning steps you just talked about, can you comment on the acquisition function?
Yeah. So, well, we just use the regular ones like UCB, or in the experiment that I showed, it was expected improvement. Yeah.
Do you find much variety or difference in those? I'm curious what your experience has been with different ways of doing this.
Not really. So if you read literature, maybe because of the amount of noise that we have in the real experiment, is not really the different acquisition functions do not really make that difference. Yeah, you can replace like expected improvement with the upper confidence bound, and the result will be more or less the same. I think that's just because of how much noise we have in our experiment that it doesn't really matter that much. I think that, but what we're exploring is also a batch acquisition functions, because sometimes it just makes more sense from the cost of experiment point of view, it makes more sense for us to measure a bunch of points at each step and not just a single point. So that is something that can make a difference. But yeah, if you look, we tried standard ones like expected improvement, probability of improvement, upper confidence bound. Most other produce more or less the same result.
When you did the batch, everything I've seen for these batch acquisition functions is basically greedy. You pick the best one and then take the best one given your first choice. Is there anything smarter than that you've run into?
No, I think we probably read the same papers describing them. That's yeah. But the thing I wanted to point out is the real experiment. It's maybe not in this case, but sometimes when you synthesize something, you have a plate with I don't know, dozens of wells, right? And you synthesize all that. You measure it all at once, right? So that's why the experimental setup in this case would require you to produce a batch of points at each next step, right? And not just sequential one, because it's just completely unreasonable if you can measure 20 samples at once. it's completely unreasonable to measure only one and leave the remaining 19 wells empty, right? So this is when we started to think about coming up with exploring this batch acquisition function. But as you pointed out, yes, it's very greedy, but it's still better. It generally still works better than just leaving 19 wells empty and just working on one. Okay. Yeah. Finally, one thing that so far we've talked about this data-centric learning, where we assume that we don't know much about the system that we study, right? So in the case of the deep kernel learning, we were learning structure-property relationships between the one modality. We can observe structure in one modality and a property in a different modality, but it's still pretty data centric. But in the real systems, we usually have some idea about the system that we study, right? It could be something that we know from literature or the information that comes from our theory collaborators, right? And sometimes it's more than one model. It's like several hypotheses, and we want to know which one is the correct one, right? And so we came up with this idea of active hypothesis learning, where the goal is to both learn the distribution of the physical property of interest and a correct model, model that describes systems behavior with as few measurements as possible. And so what we do here is that at each step, we have a list of models of hypotheses that can describe systems behavior, and running each of them at each step could be prohibitively expensive. So we need to sample one model at each step, right? And here we can use something like epsilon greedy sampling, softmax sampling policy, or something like that, right? So we sample a model, then we learn the posterior distribution over model parameters and use them to obtain predictive mean and uncertainty that can be used to derive the next measurement point, just like we do in the active learning. But also, how do we know that the model performed well, the sampled model performed well? So what we do for that is that we compare the total or median uncertainty at the current step with the total or median uncertainty at the previous step, and depending on whether the uncertainty decreased or increased, we reward or penalize our model using some predetermined reward function, okay? Yeah, so this is a simplified version of algorithm that we use. It's a good idea to start with several warm-up states to give some momentum, especially in the limit of the very sparse data. But that basically describes what I have just shown. Okay, so where do hypotheses in this active hypothesis learning come from? Well, first of all, it doesn't have to be. I think one important point I should mention is that, so you can use standalone models, but in this case, you need to be sure that at least one model is correct in your list, right? In the reality, it's not always the case. So what we do here, we wrap this probabilistic model into a Gaussian process by making it a mean function of a Gaussian process. And even if none of the model is correct, the flexibility of the GP kernel will still allow you to do active learning. You just won't learn the correct model of systems behavior.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just make sure I understand. So the goal here is that the correct hypothesis will, over time, make correct predictions.
It will lead to the fastest decrease of uncertainty. Yeah, that's the idea. But yeah. That works.
Sorry, decrease in uncertainty seems like something that's intrinsic to the model. Whereas, if a model just says it has no uncertainty, right? Why does that not?
Yeah, but you compare. I mean, you compare it to uncertainty produced in the previous step, right? And generally, and this is, I don't have any fancy math to prove it to you, but empirically, the correct model will lead to the faster decrease of uncertainty.
But it's the model's reported uncertainty.
Yes, but we're looking for a model that can explain the observations, right?
Right, but if a model is poorly calibrated, it can say it has very low uncertainty even when it doesn't match experiment.
Well, yeah, that could be the case, but the hypothesis. What do you mean by purely calibrated in this case?
So, I mean, if you have a model whose uncertainties are all very small, right?
Yeah.
If it's not calibrated, that can be unrelated to its actual match to experimental values.
That is certainly.
So, and you can do this even with GPs, right? GPs where you have a very poor kernel can end up with very poor uncertainties.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, right. So it's like there's lots of ways for a model to lie.
It is correct. Yeah, it is correct that the models need to be properly calibrated. Yeah. There is this risk. I agree. Yes, and the models we consider here are, again, they come from from years of the previous research on the systems, right? So there are like several competing hypotheses that we compare. If you really want, you can create the scenario that you just described. Yeah. So this is something we need to be very careful about. I agree. Thank you. And that's the reason I came back here. I wanted to hear some criticism. Thank you. Yeah. But in general, right? So your hypothesis doesn't have to be precise, but it should reflect general, at least partial trend in the data. And that's the same idea behind using the deterministic mean functions in GP. Right, so they can be hard-coded. That's what we did, but we can also generate them automatically via regression, symbolic regression analysis, and so on. But it doesn't also have to be limited to symbolic expression. Potentially, maybe we can explore like deep learning model, deep learning-based surrogates as a mean function in GP. Okay. Yeah. So we tested it empirically for. On various types of synthetic data, just to confirm that when we for every synthetic data with non-ground truths, we got results for like 30 random seeds, just to make sure that the models with correct the correct model generates the largest reward. And Patrick, by the way, so that's what I was talking about, right? That's how the evolution of uncertainty looks like. And generally, when you sample a model with the wrong model, it will have the spike. So that's the idea. So empirically, it works. Okay. Yeah.
That's great. No, yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So I can share. I have a notebook where everyone can play. Put their own.
I think it's very particular to the models you pick. That's because you're relying on some properties of the model and their uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right. It's
not universal. Yeah. I'm not arguing it's universal.
Yeah, I mean, this is very much like a bandit problem, right?
Absolutely.
Right. And so, but then you have something about not what the model thinks that you want to reward, but something about how valuable it actually is.
Yeah.
Right. If you want to use any of the kind of bandit style.
Yeah. Absolutely. To be completely honest, I wrote this one after I started reading a book on reinforcement learning, and I read the bandit paragraph, and then I said, well, how about we do something like that for our system? Okay. So we applied it to several experiments where we learn the correct model of system behavior in automated scanning probe microscopy experiment. And so we had 4 different models describing how ferroelectric domains grow under the tip influence that came from our collaborators. And so we explored them. Basically, start with some seed points. So we have 4 competing hypotheses here on domain switching mechanisms. We assume that these hypotheses represent a full set of possibilities for this system, and at each step, microscope selects domain writing parameters based on a sampled hypothesis and a predefined acquisition function. And then same again, the idea is that the hypothesis that leads to the fastest decrease in uncertainties is identified as the correct model, and this approach can be transferable to other synthesis and other measurements. Okay. So the other thing we've been thinking about, this was before all this, ChatGPT thing and so on. But basically, the question is, how do we produce those hypotheses? Where we get them from, right? Because for now we hard code them, and at that point we were thinking that, well, let's just maybe generate some random hypothesis and then put physical constraints on them using prior knowledge, and then pass them to this active hypothesis learning setup. But that was, like a year ago. right now, I don't know, can we train something like an analog of ChatGPT to produce scientific hypotheses and then, test them in the experiment. So, but anyway, I think I just saw a tweet from Microsoft Research where they trained a bio-GPT, right? And they claim this is like, it outperforms all other language model for biological applications. That was pretty cool. I haven't read it. I already retweeted it, but I haven't read it. But it sounds pretty cool. Anyways, this picture was made before all this, GPT recent breakthroughs with the large language models. But using them to produce hypotheses could be an interesting idea. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that I'm a huge believer in open source and open science. So all the tools that we create, that we implement, are available on GitHub. And the idea is that a domain scientist doesn't even need to know how to use PyTorch, as long as they know how to use basics of NumPy and Matplotlib. They can repeat all our experiments and adapt it to their problems. So that's the idea. But obviously, I will be. So this is currently very tailored towards experiments, but bring theory component into it. Based on all the fantastic work that I've heard about during this week, could be also very interesting, because we can generate we can identify so much experimental structures, but connecting it to theory would be interesting. Traditional simulations can be pretty long, but if we can replace some of the traditional simulations with some deep learning surrogates, it could be pretty interesting, right? Again, connecting experiment to theory is something we are very interested in. Finally, the whole thing started as, the whole thing was inspired, to be quite honest, by self-driving cars. And at that time, the idea is, okay, if we have self-driving cars, can we also, utilize some of the advancements made for self-driving cars for microscopy? But now I'm also thinking maybe, microscopy could serve as a test bed for more complex autonomous systems in robotics, self-driving vehicles, and so on. Simply because, as I said, you can visualize matter, but you can also control it, right? You can manipulate it, and it's relatively safe environment. And why not to use it as a test bed for development and deployment of some of the so-called ML/AI tools. So please think about it. That's pretty much all I want to talk about. I think it's precisely 50 minutes. I'm very proud of myself. Thank you so much for your attention.